Not a conversation, not a sit down, not even a phone call. A yellow sticky note on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, written in Marcus's handwriting, the same handwriting I had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists and the margins of the crossword puzzles we used to do together on Sunday mornings. The note said 4 sentences. I have memorized them the way you memorize something that changes the shape of your life. I need you to be gone by Friday, take what's yours. I've spoken to a lawyer, don't make this harder than it needs to be. It was a Wednesday morning, I had just come back from a 5:45 a.m. run. I was still in my gear, still had my earbuds around my neck, still had the particular clarity you get from 40 minutes of pavement and cold air. I picked up that note and I read it once. Then I set it back down exactly where I found it, poured myself a cup of the coffee that had brewed on the timer we had set together, and I sat down at the kitchen table in the house that I had helped design, in the neighborhood I had chosen, in the city we had moved to together 11 years ago, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do next. My name is Simon, I am 43 years old. I am a licensed commercial real estate attorney. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, the middle daughter of a high school principal and a woman who ran her own alterations business out of our garage for 22 years. I was raised to be precise, to be prepared, and to understand that the details other people overlook are almost always the details that matter most. I have spent the last 17 years of my professional life reading contracts that other people signed without reading them carefully enough. I know what fine print costs. I know what assumptions cost, and I know better than most people what it costs when someone underestimates you. Marcus did not know what I did for a living when he handed me that sticky note, I mean that literally. After 11 years of marriage, after building what I thought was a shared life in a 4-bedroom Tudor in Decatur, Georgia, my husband had so thoroughly stopped seeing me as a professional person that when he decided to end our marriage by giving me 48 hours to vacate the premises, it did not occur to him to consider what I actually did all day in that downtown office. He thought he was giving me an ultimatum. He handed me a blueprint. Before I tell you everything, and I am going to tell you everything, I need to say this first. What happened in the weeks after that sticky note was not something I planned in anger. I did not wake up the morning I found that note with a strategy. The strategy came later, when I sat with the full picture and understood what had actually been done to me and what my options genuinely were. I want to be clear about that because what follows is going to sound, at certain points, like a story about a woman who got even. It is not that story, it is a story about a woman who got informed and then got free. Marcus Ellison and I met in 2008 at a continuing education conference in Nashville. He was finishing his MBA at Vanderbilt. I was 2 years into my career at a mid-size real estate law firm in Atlanta. We met at the hotel bar on the second evening of the conference, and he was the kind of man who filled a room not with noise but with presence. Quiet confidence, my mother called it when I brought him home for the first time. She said it the way she said most things, as an observation that was also a warning. We dated long distance for 14 months, Atlanta to Nashville, alternating weekends, running up phone bills the way people did before unlimited plans made that quaint. He proposed on a Wednesday night in my apartment kitchen while I was making pasta. No restaurant, no speech, no elaborate setup. He just walked in from the bedroom holding a ring box from Levy's Jewelers on Peachtree Street and said, "I've been carrying this for 3 weeks and I can't wait anymore." I said yes with sauce on my hands and a wooden spoon still in my grip. We married in the fall of 2009 in Memphis, at my mother's church, with 212 people in attendance and a reception that ran 4 hours past the venue's closing time because nobody wanted to leave. For the first 4 years we were genuinely good together. Marcus built his career in commercial property development, acquiring and repositioning office buildings and mixed-use properties across the Atlanta metro. I continued climbing at my firm, eventually making partner at 38, specializing in commercial acquisitions and lease structuring. We bought the house in Decatur in 2013. We renovated it over 2 years, every decision made together, every material chosen with care. The heated floors in the master bathroom were his idea. The built-in bookshelves that covered the entire east wall of the study were mine. We did not have children. This was a mutual decision we had made early and revisited periodically and always arrived at the same place. Our work was our devotion and we were each other's family. That was the version of the marriage I believed in until approximately 5 years ago, when things began to shift in ways I told myself were temporary. Marcus became distant in increments, the way water erodes stone, slowly enough that you can convince yourself nothing is changing. He traveled more for work. He came home quieter. He stopped asking about my cases in the evening the way he used to. I told myself it was the pressure of a particular acquisition he was managing, then the stress of a deal that fell through, then the general weight of running a development company through an uncertain market. I had explanations for everything. I was very good at explanations, that is perhaps an occupational hazard. I want to tell you something about the particular texture of those 5 years because I think it is important and because I think many people listening will recognize it from their own experience. It was not dramatic. There were no screaming arguments, no thrown objects, no nights where one of us slept on the sofa. There were dinners that grew quieter. There were weekends that became parallel activities in the same house rather than shared time. There were conversations that used to run 2 hours and gradually, incrementally, compressed into 20 minutes and then into 10 and then into the efficient exchange of logistical information that a household requires. Who is picking up the dry cleaning? What time is the contractor coming on Saturday? Did you call the insurance company about the claim? We were from the outside a functioning marriage. From the inside, we were two people who had stopped turning toward each other and had not yet admitted that the turning had stopped. I adapted to this. I want to be honest about that. I told myself that long marriages have seasons, that the intensity of early partnership naturally settles into something quieter and more sustainable, that what I was experiencing was the ordinary evolution of a relationship between two busy professionals. I had read enough about marriage to know that the research supported long periods of reduced intimacy as normal, recoverable, not indicative of terminal dysfunction. I filed the distance under temporary and redirected my attention to the work that had always, in any season of my life, given back exactly what I put into it. What I did not have an explanation for until much later was Nadine. I learned about Nadine the same way I learned about the sticky note, from something I was not supposed to see. 8 months before Marcus handed me that ultimatum, I had picked up his phone by accident in the dark of our bedroom, thinking it was mine, and read the first line of a text before I realized my mistake. I put the phone down without reading further, but I had seen enough. I knew what I had seen. I did not confront him that night. I want to explain why, because I think the instinct to immediately confront is understandable but not always strategically sound. I am an attorney. I am trained to gather before I act, to build a record before I make a claim. I did not confront him that night because one line of a text is not a full picture, and I needed the full picture, not for drama, for clarity. Over the following 6 weeks, I gathered what I needed to know. Not through surveillance, not through anything that would compromise my integrity, but through the particular attentiveness of a woman who suddenly starts paying very close attention to a life she had been moving through on autopilot. I listened differently. I watched the accounts with more focus. I noted the patterns, and by the time I had a complete picture, I understood that the distance of the past 5 years had not been work pressure or market stress or the ordinary friction of a long marriage. It had been the slow withdrawal of a man building a second life and trying to figure out when and how to exit the first one. Nadine worked in his company. She was 31 years old, had joined his development firm as a project coordinator 2 years earlier, and had become, over the course of those 2 years, the reason my husband had stopped asking about my day. I am not going to dwell on Nadine at length because she is not the protagonist of this story and I have no interest in making her one. What I will tell you is that I believe she genuinely did not know the full nature of what she had stepped into, and that my quarrel was never with her. My quarrel was with the 11 years of my life that had been quietly treated as expendable. When I found that sticky note 8 months after I had first seen that text, I was not shocked, I was tired. But I was not unprepared. The 48 hours Marcus gave me were not what he intended them to be. He intended them to be a countdown. They were in fact a working window, and I used every hour. The first thing I did that Wednesday morning, after sitting with my coffee and reading the note twice more just to be certain I had understood it correctly, was call my colleague and closest friend, Diane Ose. Diane is a family law attorney at a firm on Peachtree Center Avenue, and she is, without qualification, one of the sharpest legal minds I have ever encountered. She answered on the second ring. I told her what the note said. She was quiet for approximately 4 seconds, then she said, "Come to my office now." I changed out of my running gear, drove downtown, and sat in Diane's office for 3 hours that morning. What happened in that room was not a conversation between a woman in crisis and her friend. It was a legal strategy session conducted by two professionals who understood precisely what the landscape looked like. Diane walked me through Georgia's equitable distribution framework. She reminded me of things I already knew but needed to hear articulated clearly: that Georgia divides marital assets equitably, not necessarily equally, and that equitable division considers each spouse's contribution to the marital estate, financial and otherwise. Then she asked me a question that changed the direction of the next 8 weeks. She said, "Simone, in your professional capacity, have you ever done any legal work that directly or indirectly benefited Marcus's company?" I thought about that for a long moment, and then I said, "Yes, quite a bit actually," because here is what Marcus had apparently forgotten, or perhaps had never fully understood in his haste to write that note and place it on the counter beside the coffee maker. Over 11 years of marriage, I had provided on numerous occasions legal guidance that benefited his development company. Not as outside counsel, not through my firm, but informally at the kitchen table and in the study and on the phone and in the car, the way spouses of professionals often do without anyone issuing an invoice. I had reviewed lease agreements. I had flagged problematic clauses in acquisition contracts. I had identified a title issue on a property in Buckhead in 2017 that, had it proceeded to closing unaddressed, would have exposed Marcus's company to litigation that his own attorney had missed. I had done this freely as a partner, as someone invested in our shared future. None of it was documented, all of it was real. And in Diane's office that morning, I began to understand that the story of this marriage, told accurately and completely, looked very different from the story Marcus had apparently written in his head when he decided 48 hours was sufficient notice. I want to spend a moment here on what Diane did next, because I think it illustrates something important about the value of having the right people in your corner at the right time. She did not simply validate what I was feeling. She did not offer comfort in the way that a friend who is not also a professional might have. She picked up a legal pad and she started writing. She asked me to go back through every instance I could recall, every lease I had reviewed, every contract clause I had flagged, every title issue I had identified, every phone call I had taken from Marcus's business attorney where I had contributed substantive legal thinking. She asked me to be specific about dates, about the nature of the legal question, about what the consequence of the error I had caught would likely have been. She wrote for 40 minutes while I talked. Then she looked at what she had written and she said, "This is a contribution to the marital estate. We can document it, we can value it, and when we put it in front of a judge, it is going to look very different from the picture your husband apparently has of what he is walking away from." I sat in that chair and I felt something I had not felt since Wednesday morning. I felt the ground become solid under me again. I went back to the house that afternoon. I did not pack. Marcus was not home. He was at work, at the building on Piedmont Road in Midtown Atlanta, where his development company occupied the third floor of a 6-story commercial property. A building I had been inside dozens of times. A building I knew the ownership structure of because Marcus had once, 3 years earlier, complained at length about the landlord's refusal to renegotiate lease terms, and I had, over a dinner of takeout Thai food from Nan Thai Fine Dining on Peachtree, looked up the property records out of professional habit. The building was held by a private LLC. The LLC had one primary investor who had been looking, according to public records and industry contacts I had developed over 17 years in commercial real estate law, to exit his position for approximately 2 years. I knew this because this was my industry. I knew the players, I knew the properties. I knew the capital flowing through Atlanta's commercial real estate market the way Marcus knew acquisition timelines and development margins. We had simply never compared notes, because somewhere in the last 5 years we had stopped talking about work the way we used to. I sat in the study that afternoon in the house I had been told to vacate, surrounded by the built-in bookshelves I had designed, and I made a series of phone calls. I called a private equity contact I had cultivated through my firm over a decade of deal work. I called a commercial mortgage broker who owed me a professional favor from a transaction we had navigated together in 2019, and I made a preliminary inquiry, careful, measured, professionally appropriate, about the ownership status of a 6-story commercial building on Piedmont Road. The conversation I had that afternoon was not yet a transaction. It was reconnaissance. But by the time Marcus came home that evening to find me in the kitchen, not packing, making dinner as though the note had never existed, I knew what was possible. He stood in the doorway for a moment. I could see him recalibrating. "I thought you'd be gone," he said. "I have until Friday," I said. "You said 48 hours. He sat down slowly. I put a plate in front of him. We ate in almost complete silence, which was not so different from many dinners we had eaten in the past 2 years. But the silence had a different quality that night. He was waiting for an outburst that was not coming. I was listening to the sound of everything I now understood. He said over the last of his dinner, "Simone, I think it's just better for both of us if we make this clean and quick." I said, "I agree completely." He seemed relieved, which was understandable. What he did not know was that clean and quick meant very different things to the two of us. I want to tell you what the days between that dinner and the formal filing looked like from the inside, because I think the lived texture of those days is as important as the legal and financial outcomes they produced. People hear a story like this and they imagine the protagonist moving through it with the smooth efficiency of someone executing a plan, unaffected, strategic, operating above the emotional fray. That is not what it looked like. What it looked like was a woman getting up every morning in a house that felt suddenly provisional, making coffee in a kitchen where a sticky note had changed everything, driving to work on roads she had driven for 11 years, sitting across from clients whose real estate transactions she was managing with her full professional attention while a parallel proceeding conducted itself in the background of her life. It looked like discipline. It looked like showing up. It did not look like not feeling it. I felt all of it. I simply chose very deliberately what I was going to do with what I felt. I was sleeping in the guest room by the end of that first week, not because I had been asked to, but because I had decided that the master bedroom was a room I was no longer willing to perform normality in. The guest room had a good reading lamp and a window that faced the garden, and I slept there with a yellow legal pad on the nightstand and my laptop on the small desk in the corner. And every evening before I went to sleep, I spent 30 minutes writing down everything I remembered about the informal legal work I had done for Marcus's company over 11 years. Every conversation, every document, every phone call, every instance where my professional expertise had been deployed in service of his business interests. I wrote it in the careful, systematic way I had been trained to document evidence, with dates where I could reconstruct them, with descriptions of the legal issues and the outcomes, with as much specificity as I could recover from 11 years of memory. By the end of the second week, I had 14 pages. Diane reviewed them and said, "This is more than I expected. This is genuinely substantive." I told her that was because it had genuinely happened. She said she knew that. She also said she wanted to bring in a forensic accountant named Gerald Ackerfer who specialized in valuing professional services rendered informally within a marital context. I said to bring him in. Gerald Ackerfer was a compact, methodical man who wore reading glasses on a chain and asked questions with the patient precision of someone who understood that the numbers would tell the story if he simply gave them sufficient room. He reviewed my documentation over 4 days, cross-referenced it against publicly available information about the legal market rates for the services I had described, and produced a written assessment that assigned a conservative fair market value to the informal legal counsel I had provided during the marriage. The figure was not a small one. When I saw it, I sat quietly with it for a moment and thought about all the dinners and all the phone calls and all the late evenings at the kitchen table with Marcus's contract spread between us and a glass of wine at my elbow. I had not thought of any of it as work at the time. I had thought of it as marriage. Gerald Ackheffer's assessment suggested that the distinction in the context of equitable distribution was worth examining carefully. I did not leave on Friday. I want to be accurate about the sequence of events here, because what followed has been told and retold with various embellishments by various people, and I want the record to be clear. I did not leave on Friday because Diane had filed an emergency motion related to marital property status on Thursday afternoon, which legally complicated any unilateral action on Marcus's part regarding the marital residence. Marcus's attorney, a man named Clifford Baines who operated out of a suite in Buckhead and had, from what I could observe, significantly underestimated the nature of the opposition he was dealing with, called Diane on Friday morning sounding, by Diane's account, considerably less confident than his client had apparently been at the start of the week. The phone call between Diane and Clifford Baines lasted 37 minutes. Diane told me about it afterward with the particular economy of someone reporting a professional outcome rather than dramatizing a personal victory. She said Clifford had opened by suggesting that my refusal to vacate was an unreasonable complication of an otherwise straightforward proceeding. She said she had responded by outlining in precise and well-documented terms the legal basis for the emergency motion, the 14 pages of documented informal legal services, Gerald Ackheffer's preliminary valuation, and the specific provisions of Georgia's equitable distribution statute that she intended to invoke. She said that by the end of the call, Clifford Baines had indicated that his client might be open to a more measured timeline. Diane told him that a measured timeline was the only timeline she was prepared to discuss, and that she would be in touch the following week. Marcus said nothing to me that Friday. He came home, saw that I had not packed, said nothing, and went to his office and closed the door. I went to the study, opened my laptop, and continued the work I had been doing. Meanwhile, the preliminary inquiry I had made on Wednesday afternoon had progressed with a speed that reflected both the seller's readiness to exit and the strength of the financing structure my broker contact had helped me assemble. I want to be clear about how this worked because I have seen it described in ways that make it sound more dramatic or improbable than it actually was. I was not acting in any improper capacity. I was not using privileged information. I was acting as a private individual with 17 years of commercial real estate expertise, professional relationships cultivated over that entire career, and the particular advantage of knowing exactly which asset to focus on and exactly why the timing was right. The private equity contact I had called on Wednesday was a woman named Rosalind Ferris, who had been a source of deal flow and professional collaboration for me since 2012. Rosalind moved quickly when she saw a well-structured opportunity, and she was, by Thursday evening of that first week, already in conversation with the building's existing investor through channels I had identified. The commercial mortgage broker, a man named Terrence Walls who operated from an office in Sandy Springs and who had helped me structure 3 transactions over the previous decade, had preliminary financing terms on my desk by the following Monday. The numbers made sense. The asset was sound, the existing tenant roster was stable. Marcus's company's lease had 2 years remaining at a rate that was, if anything, below current market, which meant the building had embedded upside beyond its current income. The 6-story building on Piedmont Road became the subject of a serious acquisition conversation within 72 hours of my first phone call. The letter of intent was signed 12 days after Marcus left that note on the counter. The transaction closed 41 days after that. I became, in the technical and complete legal sense, the controlling interest holder of the building in which my soon-to-be former husband's company leased its 3rd-floor office space. I want to tell you about the morning I received the closing confirmation because it was not what you might expect. It was a Thursday early before 7. I was sitting in the study with my second cup of coffee from a French press I had bought myself the previous week at Williams-Sonoma on Peachtree because I had decided, in the specific and deliberate way I was making decisions in that period, that I deserved coffee made the way I actually liked it rather than the way the programmable machine made it. The email came from Terrence's office with the subject line, "Closing confirmed, Piedmont Road." I opened it. I read through the confirmation. I set my phone face down on the desk, then I picked up the phone and called my mother in Memphis. It was not quite 6:30 in the morning there. She answered on the 3rd ring, which meant she had been up. She is almost always up before 6. "What happened?" she said, the way mothers say things when they know the answer is either very good or very bad. I told her. I told her about the sticky note and Diane's office and Gerald Ackheffer's 14 pages and Rosalind Ferris and Terrence Walls and the letter of intent and the 41 days and the closing confirmation I was holding in my hand. She listened without interrupting, which is one of her particular gifts. When I finished, she said, "Simon, your daddy would have called that a proper repair." I understood exactly what she meant. My father fixed watches. When something came to his table that had stopped running, he did not mourn its brokenness. He opened it, examined its mechanics, identified what had failed, and applied the precise intervention that the situation required. He did not force parts that did not belong, he did not rush the work, he did not declare the watch beyond saving before he had looked at it carefully, and when he was finished the thing ran, not because he had forced it, because he had understood it. I cried briefly after I got off the phone with her. Not from grief, or not only from grief, but from the particular release that comes when you have been holding something very heavy for a very long time and are finally permitted to set it down. I want to pause here and explain something that I think gets lost in the way this story tends to be told when people hear pieces of it. The acquisition was not revenge. I need you to understand this fully, not because I want to appear magnanimous, but because it is the truth, and the truth matters for what comes next. I did not buy that building to hurt Marcus. I bought that building because it was a sound commercial investment that I was uniquely positioned to execute at a moment when I needed to make a strategic decision about my financial future as a newly single woman. Did I know his company was a tenant? Yes. Was that relevant to my assessment of the building's income stability? Yes, actually, in the conventional real estate sense, an established tenant with a multi-year lease is an asset, not a liability. Did I derive some measure of quiet satisfaction from the transaction? I am a human being, of course I did. But the acquisition stood entirely on its own merits, and I would have made the same decision if the tenant on the third floor had been a dental practice. What the acquisition did was change the geometry of the divorce proceeding in ways that Clifford Baines had clearly not anticipated. Because when the full picture of Simone Ellison's professional capabilities, financial resources, and understanding of the marital estate came into view during discovery, the 48-hour sticky note looked exactly like what it was: a bluff made by a man who had deeply miscalculated the woman he was bluffing. The divorce proceedings took 9 months. I am going to tell you the essential architecture of what happened without turning this into a legal lecture, because the legal details are less important than the principles they illustrated. Georgia divides marital property equitably, and equitable means fair, not equal. Fair in our case meant that the court considered the full scope of each party's contribution to the marital estate over 11 years. Marcus's attorney had arrived at this proceeding expecting to negotiate with a woman who had been ambushed and was operating from a position of emotional distress. What he found instead was a woman who had spent 11 years in commercial real estate law, who had meticulously documented her professional contributions to her husband's business over the course of the marriage, who had retained her own expert witness to speak to the fair market value of informal legal counsel provided during that marriage, and who had, in the 41 days between the letter of intent and the closing, become the landlord of the building from which her husband conducted his professional life. The informal legal work I had contributed to Marcus's company over 11 years was assessed by Gerald Arcuffer at a figure that, when placed against the total value of the marital estate, shifted the equitable distribution calculus substantially. Diane was methodical and relentless in her presentation of this evidence. Clifford Baines objected repeatedly. The objections were noted and overruled with increasing frequency as the proceeding continued. I want to tell you about one specific moment in those proceedings, because I think it crystallizes something important about what the whole experience taught me. There was a session approximately 4 months in, during which Clifford Baines attempted to characterize my informal legal contributions to Marcus's business as the ordinary, non-compensable assistance that spouses routinely provide to each other in the course of daily life. He suggested that reviewing a lease agreement over dinner was no different from any spouse helping the other proofread an email or offering an opinion on a work decision. It was, he argued, simply what people who are married to each other do. Diane let him finish. Then she stood up and she walked the court through a specific example from my documentation, the title issue on the Buckhead property in 2017. She described the nature of the defect, the stage of the transaction at which I had identified it, the specific legal mechanism by which the defect would have created liability, the estimated value of the litigation exposure that Marcus's own transactional attorney had failed to catch, and the fact that Marcus's company had, in the years following that transaction, generated significant revenue from that property that would not have been possible had the closing proceeded without my intervention. She then asked Clifford Baines whether he wished to characterize that particular contribution as analogous to proofreading an email. There was a silence in that room that I have thought about many times since. Clifford Baines did not respond to the question directly. He moved on, but the point had been made in the only venue where it needed to be made, and the record reflected it. The marital home indicator was awarded to me. I had the stronger case for it. I had managed the renovation, handled the majority of the ongoing maintenance decisions, and my income had anchored the mortgage for the final 3 years of the marriage when Marcus's company had gone through a difficult period that he had described to me at the time as temporary, and that I had characteristically taken at his word. I refinanced it in my name alone the month the decree was finalized, with a rate I secured through a lender relationship I had maintained for 8 years. Marcus was required to vacate by a date certain with a structured settlement that reflected the court's assessment of equitable distribution. He remained a tenant in the Piedmont Road building. His lease had 2 years remaining at the time of my acquisition. He fulfilled it professionally, and I managed that tenancy through a property management company, which is how commercial real estate works when you are operating it as a business and not as a personal drama. When the lease came up for renewal, his company negotiated new terms at market rate, the same as any other tenant would. I have no interest in using a building as an instrument of punishment. It is an income-producing asset, it functions as one. I want to talk about what the 9 months of proceedings did to me personally, because I think the professional and legal narrative told without the human dimension is incomplete in ways that matter. People sometimes hear this story and conclude that because the outcome was favorable, the process must have been bearable. The outcome and the process are not the same thing. There were weeks during those 9 months when I came home from work and sat in the study without turning on a single light, and simply sat in the dark with the bookshelves around me and the quiet of the house and the weight of what I was carrying. There were mornings when the alarm went off and the first conscious thought was not strategic or productive, but simply the dull, persistent ache of having loved someone for 11 years who had, somewhere along the way, decided that I was expendable. There were moments in the proceedings themselves, not the tactical moments but the quieter ones, where something Marcus said or did not say made the reality of what had happened settle in my chest in a way that the work could not entirely manage. I had a therapist during those 9 months. Her name was Dr. Anita Rajan, and she practiced out of an office in Virginia Highland, and she had a particular gift for sitting with difficulty without rushing toward resolution. I saw her every Tuesday evening for the duration of the proceedings and for 6 months afterward. I want to say this explicitly because I think there is a version of this story that, in its emphasis on composure and strategy and professional expertise, implies that the emotional component was simply handled, set aside, processed efficiently and without cost. That would be dishonest. The emotional component was the most demanding part of the entire experience, and the reason I was able to show up with the composure I showed up with in Diane's office and in the courtroom and in that house was not that I was not feeling it. It was that I had a Tuesday evening where I could go and feel it completely with someone trained to receive it and then gather myself to continue. Dr. Rajan said something to me in our 4th session that I have carried since. She said, "Simone, you are very good at knowing what to do. What I want to work on with you is whether you know that you are allowed to not know what to do sometimes and that not knowing is not the same as not being capable." I had to sit with that for a long time. I think I am still sitting with it in certain ways. The instinct to competence, to always having a next step, to never allowing the ground to feel fully uncertain beneath you, it is a protective mechanism that served me well in those 9 months and that has also, I think, cost me things I am still in the process of identifying. Dr. Rajan did not fix that in me, but she helped me see it, which is its own kind of beginning. There was a moment approximately 6 months into the proceedings when Marcus and I had a conversation that I think of as the most honest exchange we had in the final years of our marriage. It happened, of all places, in the parking garage of the courthouse after a particularly long session. We had both walked to our cars and discovered we had parked on the same level 3 spaces apart, and there was a brief, awkward pause in which neither of us quite knew how to proceed. Said, "Simone, I need you to know that I never thought of you as someone who could be gotten rid of with a note." I looked at him for a moment, then I said, "Marcus, you wrote the note." He was quiet, then he said, "I know, I think I was trying to end something before I had the courage to face what ending it actually meant." I said, "That is the most accurate thing you have said to me in several years." He looked briefly like a man who understood the full weight of that, and I think perhaps he did. I got in my car, I drove home. I sat in the driveway for about 10 minutes before I went inside. I do not tell that story as evidence of reconciliation or softening or any movement toward the redemption narrative that these stories are sometimes expected to produce. I tell it because I think it illustrates something real about the people we are in the moments when we are most afraid, and about the gap between what we do and what we might have done if we had been more honest, more courageous, more willing to face difficulty directly rather than leaving it on a kitchen counter on a Wednesday morning and hoping it would simply be gone by Friday. Marcus was not a villain. He was a man who made a series of choices that compounded into something he did not have the directness to face, and who paid the full cost of that indirectness in a proceeding that gave his wife's contributions to their shared life their accurate weight. That is not a satisfying villain's ending. It is simply what happened. The decree was finalized on a Thursday morning in late spring. I signed the final documents in Angela's office. I should clarify that I retained Diane as my primary counsel but worked with a second attorney named Angela Merritt for certain components of the proceeding, and when the last signature was on the last page, Angela handed me a copy of the decree in a manila envelope and said, "You did this right." I thanked her. I thanked Diane, who had driven across town to be present for the finalization, because that is the kind of person she is. We went to lunch at Bacchanalia on Howell Mill Road, the 3 of us, and we ate well and talked about things that were not the proceeding, and it was in its ordinary way one of the best lunches I have had in years. That evening I went home and I sat in the study with the built-in bookshelves and a glass of Stag's Leap Cabernet Sauvignon from a bottle I had been saving specifically for this occasion, and I thought about 11 years. I thought about the conference in Nashville in 2008, and the ring box from Levy's Jewelers and the wedding in Memphis and my father dancing through the entirety of one very long song. I thought about the house in Decatur and the heated floors and the bookshelves, and the 5 years of incremental distance, and a yellow sticky note on a kitchen counter. I thought about Diane's legal pad and Gerald Ackerfer's 14 pages and Rosalind Ferris and Terence Walls, and a closing confirmation email at 6:50 in the morning. I thought about Dr. Rajan's Tuesday evenings and the parking garage and Marcus's face when I said that the note was the most accurate thing he had said to me in years. I thought about all of it for a long time. Then I finished the glass of wine and I went to bed in the house that was entirely and uncategorically mine, and I slept completely for the first time in 9 months. There are things I know now that I did not know when I found that note, and I want to close with them because I think they are the actual substance of what this experience taught me. Not the acquisition, not the legal outcome, not the equitable distribution calculation, though all of those matter and I will address them. The deeper things. The first is about the difference between being known and being seen. Marcus knew me in the factual sense, my preferences, my routines, my professional title, the way I took my coffee. What he had stopped doing somewhere in the middle years of the marriage was seeing me. Seeing me means understanding the full dimensions of a person, not just what is useful or comfortable about them, but what they are capable of, what they are building, what they will do when their back is against a wall. He stopped seeing me, and in that failure of vision, he made the most consequential miscalculation of his professional and personal life. I want every person listening to consider the people in their own lives who may have stopped seeing them fully, and I want them to consider whether they have stopped seeing themselves. The second thing is about documentation. I am an attorney, and I am aware that not everyone listening to this is in a profession that trains you to document as instinct. But I want to translate the principle into language that applies regardless of your field. The contributions you make, financial, professional, emotional, logistical, have value whether or not they are recorded, but they can only be defended when they are recorded. I had 14 pages of documented informal legal work because I spent 2 weeks at a guest room desk with a legal pad and a working memory and the discipline to reconstruct what I had contributed. Those 14 pages changed the financial outcome of my divorce. Most people in my situation would not have written them. Most people would have been too overwhelmed, too angry, too grief-stricken, too focused on the immediate emotional reality to sit down and reconstruct a professional record. I am not saying my way was easy. I am saying it was possible and that the possibility was always there and that documentation is the mechanism by which possibility becomes outcome. The third thing is about financial independence as a non-negotiable, not as a contingency plan. I had my own professional income, my own credit relationships, my own network, my own knowledge of the commercial real estate market, my own savings and investment accounts that I had maintained throughout the marriage, not because I was planning for its failure, but because I had never been willing to dissolve my professional and financial identity into a shared entity in a way that left me without resources of my own. This decision, made without drama or suspicion at the beginning of a marriage I fully intended to sustain, was the foundation that made everything else possible. When the note appeared on the counter, I did not have to scramble for financial footing. I was already standing on it. That is not luck. That is a choice made years in advance of the moment it matters. Make that choice. The fourth thing is about the people you call first. I called Diane. I called her because she was qualified to help me, and because she loved me in the particular way that a friend who is also a professional loves you, with both the heart of someone invested in your well-being and the mind of someone equipped to act on it. The quality of your circle in a crisis is not determined by who you are close to in ordinary times. It is determined by who has built the capacity to help you when the ordinary becomes extraordinary. I want you to think about who you would call. And if the answer is not clear, or if the person you would call does not have the capacity that the situation might require, that is worth knowing now before a Wednesday morning changes everything. The fifth thing is about what buildings are. I bought a 6-story commercial building on Piedmont Road because the numbers made sense and the timing was right, and I was the person in the room most qualified to see the opportunity. That is the professional explanation. But there is another explanation that is equally true. I bought it because a man who had stopped seeing me handed me 48 hours and expected me to disappear, and I needed to understand, for my own sake as much as anyone else's, what I was still capable of when the situation demanded everything I had. The building was not a message to Marcus. It was a message to myself. It said, you know how to do this. You have always known how to do this. The circumstances that required it may be painful, but the capability was never in question. Build something, then build the next thing. The sixth and final thing is about the life on the other side of the thing that cost the most. I am 43 years old. I live in the house in Decatur with the refinanced mortgage in my name and the built-in bookshelves I designed, and a dog named Chester who was my decision entirely and who operates on a schedule and a set of priorities that are entirely his own. I have a building on Piedmont Road that generates income and requires management and belongs to me. I have Diane who sends me a text every Friday morning that says simply standing up, to which I always reply standing up. I have Dr. Rajan on Tuesday evenings, though less frequently now. I have my mother in Memphis and my father's patience and a French press that makes coffee the way I actually like it. I do not have an uncomplicated relationship with the marriage I had, or with the years I spent in it, or with the version of myself who told herself for 5 years that the distance was temporary. I think about that version of myself with something that is not quite compassion and not quite frustration, but somewhere in between. A kind of honest reckoning with the choices I made and the ones I did not, with what I saw and what I chose not to see, with the ways in which my professional competence and my personal willingness to absorb difficulty coexisted in me for years without my fully understanding the cost of that coexistence. I am working on that. Dr. Rajan would tell you I have made genuine progress, and she is not a person who says that lightly. What I can tell you is that I know exactly what I have and exactly what it cost and exactly who built it. That knowledge is not a small thing. Most people spend their whole lives in relationships and houses and careers without ever being forced to the specific clarity that comes when someone hands you a note and tells you to be gone by Friday. The clarity was not worth the cost. I would not choose the cost for the sake of the clarity, but the clarity is real and I have it and I am not willing to pretend otherwise. I am standing in a house I own in a city I chose with a professional record that speaks for itself and a building on Piedmont Road that runs as a business and belongs to me entirely. Marcus gave me 48 hours, I used them well. Everything that followed was simply the application of what I already knew, brought to bear on a situation I had not asked for but was, it turned out, fully equipped to meet. That is always the answer. Not the acquisition, not the legal outcome, not the composition of the settlement. The answer is what you're equipped to meet. Know that about yourself, document it, protect it. And when someone hands you a note that underestimates you, do not correct them with words. Let the 48 hours do it for you.